Seattle, Washington is known for being the home of two of the biggest tech companies in the United States, Microsoft and Amazon. With all of its modern charm, few people will ever notice that there is an entire hidden underground city beneath the streets. This is known as the Seattle Underground, and it still contains shops and buildings that once served as the city's businesses. So why did the city of Seattle build an entire new town on top of the old one, and how did they do it? Well, on today's Geographics, we're going to explore just that. Before we get into the story of the underground city, you need to have a bit of backstory on how Seattle was founded in the first place. On November 13th, 1851, the Denny Party docked their boat on an area of the Pacific Northwest called York-Alki Point. These men had already been traveling along the Oregon Trail and felt that other towns like Portland were far too crowded for their taste. The original party consisted of three men, David Denny, John Lowe, and Lee Terry. When they first arrived, they were excited to find a plot of land where they could make up a new home, so they came up with the bright idea to call it New York-Alki. Thankfully, they later realized that this was a bit of a silly name, and they decided to call it Seattle. At the time, that new plot of untouched land, it seemed exciting, and establishing a settlement on the waterfront, it sounded rather great. David Denny wrote to his brother Arthur, "We have examined the valley of the Duwamish and find it a fine country. There is plenty of room for 1,000 settlers. Come at once." He knew that he had found their new home. Arthur Denny sailed a schooner named the Exact to meet up with the rest of the party, and he brought along 9 more adults and 12 children. On the first day of their arrival, the women and children had no idea that high and low tide was actually a thing. This might sound ridiculous to some people, but for pioneers who lived in a landlocked region their entire life, this truly was a new phenomenon. So they left all of their food and supplies on the shore, only to come back later and find out that everything had been swept away by the water at high tide. The women were so distraught that all they could do was sit on logs and sob that they wanted to get back to Portland. But this wasn't about to be the end of their misery because, well, the first winter was about to roll in. However, they stayed through the hard times, and the Denny Party went down in history as the founders of Seattle. Logging became their main industry, and they were soon able to attract more people to move to their town and open businesses. Obviously, the most plentiful material they could find were trees, so they used the wood to build absolutely everything, even down to the water pipes. There were, of course, a couple of problems, though. All of these original founders, they were just ordinary people, and none of them had any actual engineering or town planning experience. Seattle, Washington is one of the rainiest places in the United States, and the city was built very close to the water at sea level. Without any proper way to drain the water from the city streets, well, it flooded every time it rains. This caused a near constant dampness in Seattle. There was near constant mold growth, and there was disease. To make matters worse, when the water level would rise at high tide, toilets would explode sewage whenever you tried to flush them. All of this led to a city filled with rather miserable people. At this time, the residents of Seattle had absolutely no idea that just 38 years later, the entire city of Seattle would burn down like a pile of dry kindling. On June 6, 1889, Seattle was experiencing an unusually dry summer. A man named Victor Clairmont owned the woodworking shop, and his young apprentice, John Back, was making a homemade pot of animal glue. John accidentally dropped the hot glue, and he started a grease fire. He quickly grabbed a nearby bucket of water in an attempt to put out the flames, but no one told the poor apprentice that grease fires need to be snuffed out. Throwing water on it only made it worse. The fire department did not arrive for 30 minutes. By then, the flames had spread to the nearby Dietz and Mayer liquor store, the Crystal Palace Saloon, and the Opera House Saloon. Just in case you did not know, alcohol is highly flammable, and this gave fuel to the fire that was continuing to move through the town. If anything could go wrong, it did. The fire chief was out of town, so the only men left to fight the flames were volunteer firefighters who had no experience whatsoever. Even the water pipes were made out of wood, so those were burning too. The water pressure from the hydrants was also not strong enough to put out the flames, and the hoses were not long enough to reach the water on the shoreline. They were caught off guard and completely unprepared, and before they knew it, 33 blocks of Seattle were completely turned to ash. It destroyed most of the businesses and the public records, including the census. Plenty of people were evacuated in time, but there is no way of knowing exactly how many people perished in the Great Seattle Fire without the census. Over 5,000 men lost their jobs, and thousands more now had nowhere to live. The fire cost an estimated $8 million to the city and $20 million to private businesses. The city council and more than 600 business owners did not waste any time getting to work. On the morning of June 7, 1889, they all met together to discuss how to rebuild their city. The one thing that everyone could agree on was that all of the new buildings must be built of brick or stone. This way, if there was another fire, Seattle would not go up in a puff of smoke. The city had this unexpected chance at a fresh start, and they were able to fix all of the issues with their former infrastructure. Everyone knew that there was a terrible issue with flooding, and that there had never been a proper drainage system installed by the original settlers. The council proposed that they would move dirt towards the shoreline so that they could raise the city higher above sea level. The plan was to start with 10 feet of dirt near the shore and gradually get higher until it reached 35 feet. That way, the water would slope downward during a rainstorm and drain the city streets. This design actually made a lot of sense, and it was one that everyone agreed on. The only problem, of course, was that this was way back in the 1800s, and they did not have the benefits of heavy machinery that we have today. Construction, it was estimated to take 7 to 10 years, and charitable donations from around the country were scarcely enough to replace the $8 million loss. This was going to be a very slow and a very arduous process. Local business owners, they needed to get their shops up and running fast though, so they immediately began building a second city, knowing full well that it would one day be buried underneath the dirt of the new city. They made the second city street so narrow that it was barely big enough to fit a horse-drawn carriage down them. Even so, the business owners still painted signs and tried to make do with what they had. Just as these new businesses were opening, the city council went ahead, moving piles of dirt onto public property 10 to 35 feet high. For years, private property remained at sea level, and the only way to get to a business to get shopping done was to climb down a ladder. If people needed to cross the street over the top of the gaps, they would lay a ladder down and walk over it as if they were a circus performer on a tightrope. All of this was done very carefully, but it was common for people to accidentally drop their parcels from the grocery store to the streets below. So now you might be thinking, well, this all sounds pretty dangerous. And it was. The Seattle City Council, they never bothered to create roadblocks or hang warning signs that people were about to face a 10 to 35 foot drop in the middle of the street. Indeed, it was all too common for sleepy or drunk Seattle residents to accidentally walk off the ledge. A total of 17 people died falling off the curb, and the coroner's office called it involuntary suicide. As the years went on, portions of the city, they were still underground, but they needed to keep their businesses open. Many of the entrepreneurs could not afford to build a shop above ground, and so their only option was to remain down below. This is why the city council began creating new sidewalks made of glass called pavement lights. These skylights allowed sunlight to go into the underground city. When the glass was first installed, it was clear, but over the years, it took on a bit of a purple tint. When the new city, Seattle 3.0, was finally complete, those who could afford it abandoned everything in the underground city. After all, you can't exactly carry a heavy cash register, sign, or vault up a rickety ladder. One by one, people abandoned their storefronts, and it became an underground ghost town. Building the new city, Seattle 3.0, needed a lot of manpower. There was so much to do that word spread there were plenty of job opportunities available for men who were willing to haul some dirt. Eventually, the city had 10 men for every 1 woman, and you might see how this is a bit of a problem. You've got a bunch of dudes and not enough women to go around as wives. A woman named Lou Graham came up with a brilliant solution to the problem, and that was opening a bigger and better brothel. She was the only business owner who could afford to build a stone hotel that was larger than the building she owned before the Great Seattle Fire burned it to the ground. Graham wasn't just going to accept any girl as an employee, though. She expected her ladies to read books, keep up with current events, and speak multiple languages. They were also expected to play a musical instrument or sing. Basically, she wanted these women to be on the level of the high-class courtesans of Europe. If a woman showed up and did not have all of these qualities, they would take the time to teach her. Keep in mind that this was a time when many of the people living in Seattle were illiterate, so these ladies, they were highly educated and they made a lot of money. Lou Graham became the wealthiest person in the city. Even after paying her taxes, she volunteered even more of her money to become the most generous contributor to the public school system. She continued to hold that record until the 1990s, when she was finally surpassed by Bill Gates. Technically, sex work was illegal, so Graham made sure to have the ladies registered as seamstresses on the books. At one point, there were 2,500 women registered as garment workers. As long as the women were paying their taxes to the city, though, the council chose to turn a blind eye to the scandal. They decided to tax anyone listed as a garment worker at $10 per month, and taxes began pouring in from these ladies. By the next year, sex work accounted for 87% of the city's operating budget. So without these ladies of the night, it may have taken years longer for the city to be rebuilt. Lou Graham charged roughly the price of the city's upscale hotel. The city officials were treated to free alcohol whenever they came to visit, and probably a little bit more than that on the side, if you can catch our drift. Graham was smart with her money and diversified her income into stocks and bonds. She became so wealthy that when business owners struggled during an economic crisis, or if they were desperate to move their store out of the underground, they went to her for loans instead of a bank. Luckily for them, she didn't seem to have the same vindictive nature of a mob boss when it came to getting her loans back, and her generosity only led to more growth in the city's economy. Women had so much leverage in the affairs of Seattle that they were given the right to vote in 1854. This was incredibly progressive, and it happened decades before other parts of the country. The only problem was that this flood of new female voters resulted in them kicking out the corrupt city leaders. They wanted to do the right thing and clean up the city's morals. This wouldn't do, of course, and the city council felt so threatened by the female vote that they actually revoked women's suffrage and did not give them the right to vote again until it became national law in 1919. In 1896, gold was discovered in Canada, and it became a time known as the Klondike Gold Rush. Over 70,000 hopeful prospectors were passing through Seattle, and they rushed through the town so quickly they earned the nickname Stampeders. These men needed to buy supplies from local businesses. As you might imagine, there was this new influx of men into the city, and they all really needed some sewing done by the Seamstresses. Business owners marked up normal goods by 300%, and the miners, they didn't even complain about the prices. They believed that they would soon be rich from mining gold, and they gladly handed over their money. On a normal year, the city brought in $300,000 in sales, but during the Klondike Gold Rush, they brought in a whopping $25 million. In today's money, that's close to $1 billion. During the Great Seattle Fire, all of the city's rats had been killed, so for this entire time the citizens could enjoy living without fear of catching a deadly disease. Unfortunately, these years of relief did not last long, and the vermin came back on the boats and ships that were sailing from San Francisco. It became common to see rats running through the dark streets of the Seattle Underground, and no one realized that they were carrying the Bubonic Plague until 3 people died. Now people were too afraid to spend time in the underground city because of the disease. In 1907, the city set 15,475 rat traps and officially condemned the Seattle Underground as dangerous and unsanitary. They instructed citizens to remain above ground, leaving the lower half to be forgotten forever. At least that's what they thought. After the scare over the plague, average law-abiding citizens, they decided to steer clear of the area. Once it emptied out, though, it became the perfect hideaway for the city's black market. The underground city became the new home of speakeasies, opium dens, and casinos. On the upper level, Seattle looked to be one of the most wholesome cities in the United States. There appeared to be no crime or homelessness even through the Great Depression, because many of those people, they simply began to move underground. Most did not know that the darker side of the town, it was just hidden beneath their feet. We might have completely forgotten about the Seattle Underground if it were not for the curiosity and persistence of one man. In 1954, a journalist for the Seattle Times named Bill Speidel was interested in exploring the Seattle Underground, but he was not even sure how to access it or if it still existed after all of these years of abandonment. If it truly did still exist, he could see the potential for tourism and pitched the idea to his family and friends. They totally supported the idea, and he ran an article in the paper about how the city must do something to preserve the history of the Seattle Underground. Just like that, he received over 300 letters overnight from people who were willing to give financial donations, and they were eager to pay for a tour. Speidel said, and they weren't just 300 people who dashed off a letter and forgot about it. They were 300 people who tried to call me every day. He convinced those same 300 people to write into the city council in order to convince them to allow him to get into the hidden underground city. Every time he found out new historical information during his research, he would write another article and it would get worldwide attention. Eventually, he was able to open the first tour. On day 1, Bill Speidel charged $1 per ticket and 500 people showed up. With modern-day inflation, that's about $4,708 for a day's work. After researching as much as he could at the city's archives, Bill Speidel decided to write books about the story of Seattle's history. He hired tour guides who treated the history almost like it was a stand-up comedy routine and would write family-friendly dad jokes for his guides to say to the crowds. This kept people laughing, and they were always coming back for more. And of course, just like every other creepy attraction, there is also a ghost tour of the Seattle Underground. Many of the souls of the people who fell off the edge apparently still roam the narrow passageways of the old city. There are rumors of people seeing women wearing Victorian dresses, as well as reports of ghostly orbs floating around. The Seattle Underground has indeed been featured in an episode of Scooby Doo and an episode of the 1970s TV series Kolchak, the Night Stalker, where a serial killer used the underground city to secretly hunt his victims. In 1966, the US enacted the National Historic Preservation Act, which put funding towards preserving parts of the United States that hold significant historic value. After bringing attention to the space, Seattle's underground Pioneer Square was added to the National Register of Historic Places. There were many portions of the underground city that were forced to remain off limits to the general public because they were considered to be too dangerous. Support beams are being added on a regular basis and brick arches were built in certain parts of the underground. These have successfully kept the city stable. We can only hope that it will remain open for many years to come. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification bell. This is a new channel, so that really does make a difference. Also, why not check out one of our videos from the archives linked to on the screen now? And as always, thank you for watching.